So if you don't know what, we have a pastoral staff. We have 5 guys on it. So you have me, Pastor Ken, Pastor Jared, Pastor Derek, and Pastor Trevor. And what we have decided to do, we started last week, we're going through a series called 9 Marks. It's a series of about 11 books that talk about the main things of ministry, and we are going through them with our staff, and we're reading these small books, and then we're basically hammering out both our theology and how we pragmatically work out our theology. We want to get the main thing main. And so we started off with this book, and it's called The Gospel. Simple little book. It's trying to explain what is our main message. And in this book, last week we read this passage that I think is a perfect way to start today's message. And it talks about the difference between a large G God and having a small G God. And listen to what he says. First of all, who is God? That's the first question of the gospel. Because the word God is so familiar to us that we often gloss over it. But we need to think about it. Not one of us has ever had a single thought about God that was fully fair to the magnitude of who He really is. So who is the God of the Christian gospel? And instead of explaining it, this writer says, what I want to do is I want to turn it upside down. Greg Gilbert uses satire to help us see how we naturally diminish, that means bring down our concept of God. So he's going to describe the small g God. Here's what he says. Let me introduce you to small g God. You might want to lower your voice a little before we go in. He might be sleeping now. He's old, you know, and doesn't much understand or like this newfangled modern world. His golden days, the ones he talks about when you really get him going, were a long time ago, before most of us were even born. That was back when people cared about what he thought and considered him pretty important to their lives. Of course, all that's changed now, though, and God, poor fellow, just never adjusted very well. Life's moved on and passed him by. Now he spends most of his time just hanging in the garden out back. I go there sometimes to see him, and there we tarry, walking and talking softly and tenderly among the roses. Anyway, a lot of people still like him, it seems, or at least he manages to keep his poll numbers pretty high. And you'd be surprised how many people even drop by to visit and ask for things every once in a while. But of course, that's all right with him. He's here to help. Thank goodness. All the crankiness you read about sometimes in his old books, you know, having the earth swallow people up, raining fire down on cities, that sort of thing, all that seems to have faded in his old age. Now he's just a good-natured, low-maintenance friend who really is easy to talk to, especially since he almost never talks back. And when he does, it usually to tell me through some slightly weird sign that what I want to do regardless is all right by him. That is really the best kind of friend, isn't it? You know the best thing about him, though? He doesn't judge me. Ever. For anything. Oh, sure, I know that deep down he wishes I'd be better, more loving, less selfish and all that, but he's realistic. He knows I'm human and nobody's perfect, and I'm totally sure he's fine with that. Besides, forgiving people is his job. It's what he does. After all, he's love, right? And I like to think of love as, quote, never judging, only forgiving. That's the God I know, and I wouldn't have him any other way. Okay, we can stop talking about him now. And don't worry, we don't have to stay long with him. Really, he's grateful for any time he can get. So that's the small g God. I was trying to think of an illustration of what I think he would look like. I think he'd look a lot like this. Remember the Princess Bride? And in the Princess Bride, she gives this old king a kiss on the cheek. And he says, "What was that for?" And she said, "Oh, you've been so kind. And I just think this is the last time I'm going to see you, because tomorrow morning I'm going to kill myself." And he says, "Oh, that's nice, dear." Kind of oblivious to everything. I think we think God's like that, honestly. I think If the small g God is the God you think exists, everything in your life, everything, and I mean everything, will be tainted because thoughts lead to actions. And if your thoughts are tainted, your life won't have heaviness. It won't matter, really. And I think that's why the world is a mess. I'm going to refer to it a little bit more, but like the floods in Nebraska and Minnesota, when your God is a small g, evil will flood its banks, and there will not be anything he can do about it. It'll just start taking over the countryside. This is what's going on today in our study of Genesis 19, so if you could turn there, and I would say hands down, this is one of the worst stories besides the crucifixion in all of the Bible. I tell you what, I hated studying it this week. I thought I'd enjoy it. I hated it. Because not only do the images burn in your mind, if you're going to imagine it, it's horrendous. But the carnage at the end, the carnage, like probably 30,000 people were slaughtered from fire and brimstone from the sky. That's terrible. But you know what the thing that really bothered me the most? It's like reading our front page news. So here's how we're going to attack this. I want to kind of bring you into the story of Sodom and Gomorrah. It's like I'm going to hand you a program, and we're going to work through the program in 3 acts. So here's your program, Sodom and Gomorrah. Act 1 is going to be called Enough. Enough, that means when God has enough. Act 2 is going to be when total depravity becomes total. What does it look like when total depravity totally takes over? And then Act 3 is going to be flee. Get out. Run. Don't. Just run. And then we'll have final thoughts or concluding thoughts. So let's begin with Act 1. Let's read it, Genesis 19, 1 through 3. Act 1 is titled, Enough. Genesis 19:1. The 2 angels arrived at Sodom in the evening, and Lot was sitting in the gateway of the city. So that means he's got high rank. He's a high-ranking official. The gateway of the city means he's at a place of import. He's important. So Lot was sitting at the gateway of the city, and when he saw them, so he sees these 2 men coming to the town, he got up to meet them, and he bowed down with his face to the ground. So he knew these guys were important. I don't know if he knew if they were angelic, but he knew these guys were seriously important, very important people. So he bowed down, face to the ground. And so all that stuff, he didn't show hospitality. They show hospitality, or he does. Verse 2, my lords, he said, please turn aside to your servant's house. You can wash your feet and spend the night and then go on your way early in the morning. And it was a customary thing to wash their feet because they live in the desert. They walked a long distance. Here, have a seat. It's kind of like, come on in my house. I'll take care of you. You can, if you need to, go take a quick shower. I'll wash your feet, whatever. No, they answered, no. We'll spend the night in the square. But he insisted so strongly that they did go with him and entered his house. He prepared a meal for them, baking bread without yeast, and they ate. So he made a nice dinner for them. They said they probably had some lamb and some unleavened bread. This chapter, specifically the events, are linked with the chapter right before it. If you go back to chapter 18, verse 20 and 21, it gives you why chapter 19 exists. 18, 20, and 21, the Lord, who's one of the 3 walking with the other 2, said, the outcry against Sodom and Gomorrah is so great and their sin so grievous that I will go down and see if what they have done is as bad as the outcry that has reached me. If not, I will know. So they're sent because God hears their sin coming up to his ears, their outcry. Over flooding its banks, if you will. And so what he does is he sends these angels to spy out the bad land. For the purpose of what? Look at verse 28. He's sending them to see if he can find any people that are good, because if they're not, he's going to destroy it. Verse 28. Verse 31, he's going to destroy it. verse 32, he's going to destroy it. So, the intent of chapter 19, these two men are sent. It's kind of like the opposite of spying on the promised land. It's spying on the cursed land, and they're not scared of the people going into the land because they're the ones to fear, because they're coming to destroy. That's the point. That's what's going on. Because the outcry has reached God's ears. There's this, if you believe in a small g God, there's a notion that he never loses his patience. It's always there. It's unending, as if he's always going to forgive you. But if you know this big G God, there's a point to where he has a limit. I want you to go to Romans. We're going to keep going back to chapter 19, but I want you to see Scripture on your own. I want it to speak to you today. Go to Romans 2. Romans chapter 2, to me, personally speaking, is one of the scariest verses in all of the Bible. It's a behind the curtains verse. Gives you a sneak peek of what's really going on in the world. So if you want to understand the world rightly, Romans 2, 4, and 5 tells you what's going on behind the scenes. Let me read it, and then I diagrammed it for you to show you. Romans 2, 4, and 5. Do you show contempt for the riches of his kindness, tolerance, and patience, not realizing that God's kindness leads you towards repentance? So yes, God is patient, but there's a purpose behind the patience. The purpose behind the patience is repentance. That's what he's saying. And then you go to verse 5. But because of your stubbornness and your unrepentant heart, you are storing up wrath against yourself for the day of God's wrath. So here's the diagram. So you have on the right side, this guy is sinning. He's a sinner. And God hears what he's doing. God hears and he sees everything. He does. And so each sin is kind of starts stacking up. And then it gets worse. And then it gets worse. And then it gets worse. And the reason why you don't see anything happening to you is because God is kind. He's rich in patience and kindness, and he stores it up. The reason nothing is happening to you is because God is storing it up. It's not because he doesn't see. Listen to what Jesus says in Matthew 23:37. He says, O Jerusalem, Jerusalem, you who kill the prophets and stone those who sent to you, how often I have longed to gather your children together as a hen gathers her chicks under his wings, but you weren't willing to come to me. I long to gather you, but you don't want me. And then you have Revelations 18:4. Listen to this. This is Revelations 18:4. This is terrifying. Come out of her, my people, so that you will not share in her sins, so that you will not receive any of her plagues, her punishment, that's wrath. For her sins are piled up to heaven, and God has remembered her crimes. So what happens is there's a limit, and when the outcry reaches God's ears, he has enough. So if you go back to the story, this is when God has enough. If you notice in verse 1, the two angels arrive at Sodom in the evening. That's 19 verse 1. The last time we saw these two angels, they were visiting Abraham by the great trees of Mamre. The distance between Sodom and Mamre, there's some discrepancy because they're not sure exactly where Sodom is. If it's in the southernmost part of the Dead Sea, it's 120 miles away. If it's the northernmost, it's about 40. Some speculate where there's some sulfur pits down there, about 60 miles away, 70 miles away. So 70 miles away from Mamre takes 3 miles an hour to walk. So if you're going to walk that, it would take you 20 hours. We're saying 60 miles. But they get there within 4 to 5. They're fast. Jill probably taught them cross country, so they can They're fast, but the intent is they got there fast because judgment comes swiftly. Psalm 104 verse 4 says, He sends His angels who ride the winds. And then Leviticus says, when I'm ready, I will bring upon you sudden terror. So in other words, when God has enough, He acts fast. So from the story, we need to also understand the reason He acts fast is because He's not stupid. He's not the small g God who's old and out back puttering in the garden. Galatians says He won't be mocked. That is why in verse 2, you have a really interesting dialogue. Look at the dialogue in verse 2. My lords, he says, please turn aside to your servant's house. You can wash your feet and spend the night and then, get up early and just get out of here. And they say no, and I think they say it like this, no, you know what? We're going to spend all night outside. No. Nope, no. No, what you need to, that's why verse 3, I'm insisting, you stay in here. Why? Because he knows. He knows what's going on. It's funny, I can remember my sister, when my mom and dad would go to bingo sometimes, they like to go to bingo on Saturday nights. I know some of you don't play bingo. My parents played bingo. Don't judge them. They were Catholic at the time, so they played bingo every Saturday night. And if they won, they'd bring home pizza. It was a great deal for me. But sometimes when they would go play bingo, my sister would have her friends over who would have some beer. And then what they would do is they'd take the beer cans and they'd throw them across the railroad tracks. And what's really funny is my dad knew it. My sister didn't know he knew it. So when he came home, he always walked the dog by the railroad tracks. And my sister, for some reason, that'd be the one time she always volunteered to walk the dog. Dad, I'll walk. No, Gene, I'll walk. No, Dad, let me walk the dog. Or have you ever walked in on your kids and all of a sudden the station changes really quick? Hey, what were you watching? Can I see? Go back. No, nothing. I was watching Hannah Montana or something like that. Or, you go, hey, can I see your phone? Oh, battery's dead, Dad. Can I see what you're looking at? Battery's dead. Or when I was a youth pastor, I can remember I'd turn on the lights in the gym, and in this back room, I'd find a guy and a girl, and I'd say, hey, what are you guys doing back here? Oh, we're looking for soccer balls. Well, there's about 100 out on the floor right now. What are you doing back here? God's not stupid. He sees what you're doing. He knows what you do. So, when He sees what you're doing, I wonder, do you think God has enough? Has God had enough? Here's the main problem with asking that question. And this is what we don't understand. The exact time when God has had enough is the exact time when most of us have written Him off. The exact time when He's had enough is the exact time when He has morphed into a small g to us. Listen to what go to Psalm 50:21. I want you to see it with your own eyes. Psalm 50:21. So verse 21 in Psalm 50 says, These things you have done, and I've kept silent. What things? Well, you sin, you adultery, you steal, you speak continually against my son Jesus, probably taking His name in vain. These things, these sins you're doing, and I'm keeping silent. And you know how we view God when He keeps silent? He says, you thought I was altogether like you, meaning you morphed me into a small g God. You think I'm just another guy. But I will rebuke you and accuse you to your face. That's terrifying. That's why Jesus says in Luke 12:39, you must also be ready because the Son of Man will come at an hour when you do not expect Him. Why? Because the moment He decides He's had enough is the moment we turn Him into a small g. Act 2, when depravity becomes total. Let's go back to Genesis 19, and you want to buckle up for these passages. Starting in verse 4. So they just says he prepared a meal for them. Verse 4, before they had gone to bed, so the idea is it's dark outside. It's dark at the city. It's night. So before they had gone to bed, all the men from every part of the city of Sodom, both young boys and old. What are boys doing there? This is adult behavior, isn't it? Well, the boys get caught up in it too, both young and old. Surrounded the house. They called to Lot. Where are the men who came to you tonight? Huh? Bring them out so we can have sex with them. Lot went outside to meet them, shut the door behind him. You can see him kind of holding the doorknob behind his back, and he says, no, my friends, no, fellas, don't do this wicked thing. Look, make a deal with you. I have 2 daughters who haven't slept with a man. They're virgins. Let me bring them out to you, and you can do whatever you want with them. How about that? But just don't do anything to these men, for they've come under my protection, my roof. You know, some people say, well, it's because he understands hospitality. I think he knows these guys have significant weightiness to them. They're emissaries from heaven. He knows he's in trouble. Like there's this big thing about, well, you know, the customs of that day is you take care of your visitors, which is true, but this is going, you don't take care of your visitors to the point where you give your daughters to men. It's weird when you read commentators how they don't take the seriousness of this. Get out of our way. Get out of their way. Get out of our way, they replied. And they said, this fellow came here as an alien. I mean, Lot, who do you think you are? And now you want to play the judge? You want to tell us what to do? We'll treat you worse than them. That's sick. They kept bringing pressure on Lot, moved forward to break down the door. But the men inside reached out and pulled Lot back into the house and shut the door. Then they struck the men who were at the door of the house, young and old, with blindness, so they could not find the door. The 2 men said to Lot, do you have anyone else here, sons-in-law, sons or daughters, or anyone else in the city who belongs to you? Get them out of here, because we are going to destroy this place. The outcry to the Lord against his people is so great that he has sent us to destroy it. So Lot went out and spoke to his sons-in-law, who were pledged to marry his daughters. He said, hurry, get out of this place, because the Lord's about to destroy the city. But his son-in-laws thought he was joking. Yeah, okay, God's going to destroy it. Yeah, right. When I read this the first time, like I was reading this while I was reading the news, and it makes you shudder if you try to imagine it. It started reminding me a little bit about how I started seeing the destruction of what happened in Nebraska and Minnesota this last week. It was terrible. It's both fascinating in one sense, but it's horrifying. Look at some of these pictures. It's kind of like this. So that's the Missouri River last year at this time on the left side. This is the Missouri River last week. That's how much flooding happened in Nebraska. But it's an aerial view, so it doesn't look like much. So let's go in a little bit. That's one of the main highways or thoroughfares in one city, right in that area of the Missouri Delta. Then you go a little bit further in, so just to get across, a guy has to walk. Because look at all the logs and everything that have been swept in. And then if you go a little bit into some of the communities, it's horrendous what the floods have done. And even go into some backyards and just, that guy's got a generator on the back of his truck trying to get something. But when a flood comes, when it's bad, it overrides its banks. When it overrides its banks, you can't stop it. That's the point of evil. When evil in a society runs past its banks, that means its normal path. When you stop living the way you've been designed, you can't stop the damage. It ruins both the offender and the offended. The innocent and the guilty get caught up in the flood. This is how it happens in Sodom. I call it the Sodom 3-step, and it's something America is doing right now. Step number 1 of the Sodom 3-step is the searing of the conscience. That happened in verses 3 and 4, where he's insisting they, it's not, he's embarrassed. He's embarrassed for them, but he's not broken by what the people are doing. In verse 8, he's willing to keep them happy by offering up his daughters. So what is happening to Lot is Lot no longer blushes with what they do. It doesn't faze him. I think he's seared his conscience. And any of us who've lived in a warped culture for any certain period of time, the same thing starts happening. Here's the best definition I've heard of searing the conscience. And you find this verse in 1 Timothy 4:2. But here's the best definition of searing the conscience. The conscience acts as a judge who smiles upon obedience and frowns upon disobedience. So you have this internal law. He doesn't make the law, he's a judge. He smiles when you obey this internal law or the law of God, and he frowns on you on the inside when you disobey it. And so what happens is the way he passes judgment, when you disobey, you feel guilt, shame, and remorse. That's the conscience. Guilt, shame, and remorse. When you obey, you feel pleasure.